What if I told you that one of the most powerful kingdoms of the Middle Ages didn't fall because of a straightforward clash of swords, but because of a single catastrophic decision? Welcome to this explainer. We're looking at what is essentially a historical thriller today, a deep dive into how the greatest Crusader army ever assembled in the East was just utterly annihilated in a matter of days. It's the anatomy of a disaster. Okay, let's dive into this. To truly grasp what happened here, we kind of have to reframe how we look at medieval warfare. This conflict, it wasn't just about steel and heroic cavalry charges. It's actually a masterclass in environmental weaponization and sheer psychological warfare. So, how exactly did the scorching sun, unbearable thirst, and the absolute tactical genius of Sultan Saladin unmake a century-old kingdom over a single weekend? Well, let's find out. Section 1. Setting the perfect trap. Now, to figure out how this trap was set, we've got to look at the political landscape of the late 12th century Levant. You see, the true enemy of the Crusaders wasn't actually just the opposing army massing on their borders. No, their absolute greatest vulnerability was their own severe internal dysfunction. On one side of the board, we have Saladin. By 1187, he had pulled off something remarkable. He'd unified the territories of Egypt and Syria, bringing together immense resources and a highly cohesive Ayyubidid army. On the flip side, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was hopelessly fractured. King Guy was a notoriously weak ruler, and he was caught squarely between two warring factions. You had a pragmatic peace party led by Raymond of Tripoli, who really understood the need for coexistence, and a highly aggressive war party led by guys like Gerard de Ridefort and Raynald of Châtillon, who were constantly pushing for expansion. And wouldn't you know it, it was this war party that ultimately lit the fuse. Operating from his seemingly impenetrable fortress of Kerak, Raynald of Châtillon kept breaking truces. He was raiding wealthy Muslim caravans and just completely ignoring King Guy's orders to knock it off. In one particularly egregious raid, he plundered a massive caravan, which basically handed Saladin the perfect, unassailable justification to launch a full-scale invasion. Saladin was so furious about this, he actually made a chilling vow. He swore to execute Raynald with his own sword. Section 2. The Fatal Decision. All right, that brings us to July 1187. Saladin marches this massive army across the Jordan River. But, and here's where his genius shows, he doesn't just attack the Crusaders blindly. Instead, he initiates a brilliant psychological ploy designed specifically to exploit those exact internal divisions we just talked about. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Saladin's trap unfolds in 4 very distinct phases. The Crusaders were safely camped at Saphoria, it was highly defensible, they had abundant water, Saladin knew he couldn't break them there. So, step 1, he besieges the city of Tiberias to use it as bait. Step 2, lure the Crusader field army out of that safe camp and into the arid wasteland. Step 3, uses light cavalry to constantly harass and slow them down. And finally, step 4, completely cut off their access to water. It was a perfectly laid out trap. Using Tiberias as bait was a total masterstroke because the city belonged to the wife of Raymond of Tripoli. Remember, he's the leader of the peace party. His own wife was trapped in the citadel. And yet, at a dramatic overnight war council, Raymond begged King Guy to stay put. He was literally willing to sacrifice his own wife and his city just to save the kingdom's only field army. But logic lost out to pride. The war party viciously bullied King Guy, calling Raymond a coward, and ultimately pressured the king into ordering a disastrous march to relieve the city. Section 3. March into the furnace. So, picture this. On the morning of July 3, 1187, an army of 20,000 Crusaders, carrying their most sacred relic, the true cross, marched away from their water supply. They were marching straight into a furnace and directly into Saladin's waiting hands. I mean, just look at that number, 40 degrees Celsius. That's over 104 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the absolute peak of midsummer in the Middle East. Now imagine being a knight marching under a cloudless, blazing sky, trapped inside heavy metal chainmail and thick leather undergarments. Every single step would have been agonizing. And to make matters worse, they had chosen a 25-kilometer route that didn't have a single stream or functioning well. And this brilliantly illustrates how Saladin turned the landscape itself into a devastating weapon. Tactically, he knew his fast-moving, lightly armored horse archers could just run circles around the sluggish, heavily armored Crusaders. They swarmed the column, firing volleys of arrows and retreating, forcing the knights to constantly halt to defend themselves. Then, Saladin took it a step further. He ordered his men to set fire to the dry brushwood on the plateau. The wind blew the scorching, acrid smoke directly into the faces of the already suffocating and parched Crusaders. It was absolute environmental devastation. Section 4. A Night of Torment. By sunset on July 3rd, that Crusader column was completely and utterly exhausted. They hadn't made it to the water at Tiberias, and they hadn't reached the springs of Hattin either. They were forced to halt and make camp right there on the dry, exposed plateau, completely surrounded by the enemy. What followed was a night of pure, visceral horror. Saladin engaged in absolute psychological torture. His rested men surrounded the Crusader camp in the dark. They chanted, they beat drums, they set even more brush fires to choke the camp with smoke. But the most devastating tactic of all? Saladin had camel loads of fresh, cool water brought up from Lake Tiberias, and his men demonstratively poured it onto the dry sand just out of reach of the Crusaders, who were literally going mad with thirst. Looking at the speed of this collapse, it is staggering. July 2, Tiberias is besieged. July 3, the Crusaders are physically broken by that agonizing march. By the dawn of July 4th, the trap snapped shut entirely. Driven mad by thirst, the Crusader infantry completely broke discipline. They abandoned the heavily armored knights to run desperately toward what they thought was water, only to be easily cut down or captured by Saladin's waiting troops. Section 5. The Horns of Hattin. Stripped of their infantry, King Guy and his remaining knights had nowhere left to go. They retreated to make their final stand on a pair of rocky, waterless volcanic hills known as the Horns of Hattin. The disciplined Muslim army closed the ring. The end was brutal, and at this point, entirely inevitable. The surviving knights launched these desperate, suicidal cavalry charges down the hill, just trying to break Saladin's lines, but they were repeatedly thrown back. Eventually, Saladin's forces pushed up the slope. They captured the Bishop of Acre, they seized the True Cross, and shortly after, the king's red tent collapsed. Just like that, the greatest Crusader field army in the world had been unmade. There's this famous, almost cinematic moment in the immediate aftermath. The exhausted Crusader leadership was brought before Saladin. In a well-known display of chivalry, Saladin handed a goblet of iced rose water to King Guy. But Guy, who didn't understand the local custom that offering a prisoner water meant you were sparing their life, handed the cup to Raynald of Châtillon. Saladin immediately struck the cup away, stating, "I did not ask this evil man to drink." Fulfilling his earlier oath, Saladin took his sword and personally executed the truce-breaker right then and there. Now, while Saladin spared the king and most of the secular nobles for ransom, he showed absolutely zero mercy to another specific group. He executed 200 captive knights of the Templar and Hospitaller orders. Why? Well, it was a cold, strategic calculation. He knew these fanatical military orders were far too ideologically dangerous to ever be ransomed. If he freed them, they would simply return to fight him again. Let's move to Section 6, the Fall of Jerusalem, and see how this builds into the broader picture. By destroying the field army at Hattin, the Crusaders had essentially left their castles and cities completely defenseless. Saladin swept through the coast with breathtaking speed. By September 1187, he laid siege to the ultimate prize, Jerusalem itself. The defense of Jerusalem was led by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few guys who actually survived Hattin. Knowing he couldn't win a prolonged siege, Balian issued a desperate, terrifying ultimatum to Saladin. He said if honorable terms weren't granted, the Crusaders would completely destroy the city from the inside, including the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Recognizing that desperate people do desperate things, Saladin pragmatically backed down from a bloody assault. Instead, he granted highly civilized, peaceful terms of surrender, allowing the citizens to ransom their freedom.
So what does this all mean? A century of Crusader rule in the Holy Land wasn't slowly chipped away over decades, it was effectively broken in a single weekend. Was the fall of Jerusalem an inevitable shift in power due to Saladin's brilliant unification? Or was it the tragic consequence of a single failed decision to choose pride over patience and march an army straight into a waterless furnace? Think about that, and how easily the course of history pivots on the hubris of a few.